Well, hello, and welcome back to a new season of the Gaming Podcast for DigiPride 2024. Oh my God, we're here. We're here. It's 2024. We're doing all the cool things. It's going to be amazing, this DigiPride. I'm your host, as always, Miabyte, as we dive into all manner of the most curiously captivating conversations on the web. Definitely
Missed
messed
out
that up.
here.
It's the first time. Yeah, incredibly. And this season of the podcast is tied in with our annual DigiPride celebrations. This year, DigiPride is presented by Giamma Games and sponsored by Devolver Digital and Wizards of the Coast. To find out what's in store across these 6 weeks, head on over to gamingmag.com/DigiPride. And now for this episode, you could see them on the screen already. Well, you can't if you're an audio listener, but please welcome back my longtime guest host who we've not seen in a hot minute. It's Robin.
Yes, it's
Hello.
me.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing. I am definitely
You're
doing.
doing the doing.
It is a Sunday. Is it the end of the week or the start of the week to you?
It's the end of the week in the UK. It's the start of the week in the US because our US colleagues seem to start their week on a Sunday for some reason, and I don't know why.
It doesn't make any sense. The week begins.
It's probably
with
a lovely Christian value.
Yeah, possibly. Who knows? Anyway, it's the end of the week to me, so I am exhausted as per usual. But that's just living with chronic illness. But yeah, how yourself? You good? You're good.
Yeah,
generally?
good. All good. DigiPride started last week. It's all going well. Very exciting. Had some good things happening already, which is really cool.
Yeah, I played.
So go and check out your forward slash DigiPride. You did play some lovely games with Toph. Some wonderful indies. We've got some good stuff coming up later this week as well.
Yes, but enough about that. More about today. So, 35 years ago this month, a little game called Caper in the Castro released, which was the first ever LGBTQ-focused game, let's say. To celebrate, we're going to be talking about the entire history of queer gaming in about 35 minutes, hopefully, give or take.
Yes, it should be fine. No pressure. But to help us on this journey, we are calling on a game academic, developer, player, and activist all the way from the State University of New York at Buffalo. It's Assistant Professor Cody Mejeur. Hey, Cody.
Hello, Cody.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, sorry, I had muted myself backstage. But hi, thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to come onto the show. So we're gonna kick this off real quick with you giving us a brief overview of you, your career, and your areas of work for those who might not be familiar with you.
Yeah, I'm very early career, but it still feels like a lot of pressure even to just say that, quickly. I mean, I'm a lifelong game player. I've always been attracted to games, I think, as a way of expressing myself and finding others, as a lot of us gamers have been. I started my academic career actually doing English language and literature and teaching.
Wow.
And then I started looking at games and narratives, and that led me to grad school and then on to eventually getting me, where I am today. And so now I'm an assistant professor at the University at Buffalo. I teach in a media study department, and I teach both game studies and research, mostly focusing on trans, queer, and feminist games and on narrative in games. And then I also teach game design as well. And so I get to kind of do both things, and it's always exciting to get to do them together.
Wow, I was gonna say that's quite the jump from English lit into everything that you do now. That's how did that come about? Was that a direction you were just like, you know what, I just want to do this now, or did you kind of fall into that?
It was actually, I was in, I think the course was called something like Studies in the Novel or something, and we were reading Kafka's The Trial, and I was playing Silent Hill 2 at the same time, and I was like, these two very different things are they're creating similar sort of feelings for their audiences, right? These feelings of sort of being lost in a fog, and things are threatening you, but you can't see them and understand what they are. And so I wrote this sort of comparison analysis of the two things, and my professor was like, that's great, you should do more of that. Actually, yeah, led me to keep pursuing that then.
It's wonderful when people think that games is kind of this new fangled hyper digital thing, but so much in like any other entertainment form, so much of it is based on some version of written work that goes back to the year dot. We've seen how many times Romeo and Juliet been done in a variety of different movies, some good, some bad. Sorry, Leah. And because for example, I'm quick shout out to one of the sponsors, Jammer, who are just released a demo of Inotria that Mia's playing on Tuesday, actually. That entire game, brand new game, Souls-like, but is based on Commedia dell'arte, which is one of the oldest art forms of masked theatre ever. But it's amazing to sort of like just tease these things forward and backward through history.
Absolutely. And I think like comparing, it's really struck me like doing these different sort of things throughout my training and now, being a professor, whether you're making a game or teaching someone to write an essay or teaching someone to, interview someone or do a podcast, so much of it is thinking about your audience and, what do you want them to learn or walk away thinking or feeling. Game design is designing experiences, right? It's designing experiences that do that same thing that, designing an essay and writing that out and making an argument. They're very similar sort of like aims, and then like building a thing that helps you get to those aims. And so there's a lot of connections, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we regularly think about our audience and then try and do the opposite. No, we regularly think about our audience and decide that we need to do a history podcast occasionally to give them a little bit of education.
Honestly, some people need it. Some people need a bit of a kick up the butt.
Know your history. That's what we're saying. Anyway, talking of history, let's go.
Yeah. Let's go. We're going to move on to the main conversation, which is funnily enough, the history of queer games.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, Mia, it's 35 years to the month, May 1989. Picture it, May 1989. Where CM Ralph, a wonderful, wonderful visual artist, released Caper in the Castro, which is held by many to be the first ever LGBTQ game in a way of being made by a queer person for the queer community. We actually reached out to CM for a quick quote about this historic milestone, and it's honestly a pleasure to be able to quickly read it to you, associated with a wonderful picture of this fabulous person. So CM says, I'm both humbled and honored to be asked for a comment regarding the 35th anniversary of my game Caper in the Castro. What began as a simple what-if creative project for me has over the years grown a life of its own and traveled around the world. I am grateful for the opportunity to share it with all of you. My message on this occasion is to the next person out there who's asking themselves, what if? Stay inspired by focusing on what's good in the world, reject cynicism, create every day, strive toward building communities of greater tolerance, inclusion, kindness, and hope.
That's such a wonderful message. Like, I absolutely love that. And it just occurs to me now that this game released when I was 3 months old. And so now I feel like a fossil, 35 years. Wow. Okay.
4 years for me. Let's not go there, but yeah.
Let me process that for a moment. Okay, I'm good. All right. So, Cody, 35 years since Caper in the Castro. What can you tell us about this particular seminal game, and how did it change the landscape for queer representation in gaming?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would start even with CM Ralph's own words that Robin just read out, right? Like the focus on community being such a strong one. CM Ralph has talked about the game as being charityware initially, and that like this was a game that they were making in their own spare time. Like they had a full-time job, and then in the evenings were getting home and just like pouring themselves into making this game. And the end goal of that being to release it and get some profits that would be directed to AIDS activism, AIDS organizations, community supports, right?
Wow.
And so that was the goal, right? Like I'm making this for me and for my community, and to hopefully drive some more attention, some more awareness, and also some more money toward this ongoing crisis, which CM Ralph and others have also, talked about the importance of media at the time. Living through a very pressing crisis where you knew people who were dying,
Mm.
and also knew a lot of the others didn't care about that, right? But that this game was sort of a way to draw attention to that. Um, and in terms of like how it changed queer representation, I think that the thing that's so amazing about this game is that it sort of set the stage for a lot of queer games we've seen in the years since. And to me, a lot of the sort of best games are these ones that they're made sort of by queer and trans people for queer and trans people. And that's the goal, right? It's not necessarily to make it big or to sell millions of copies, although of course if that happens, wonderful too.
Mm.
But rather that it's really sort of for us and for our communities, and I think that Caper and the Castro is entirely about that.
Mhm. Would I be mistaken in thinking that the release of this game originally was some kind of like equivalent of message boards on the internet back in the day? Was there something like that going on with that particular game? So I'm not quite like I didn't do much research into this because you're the expert. So, but I had
Yeah.
heard something about that.
Yeah, so my understanding is that the original release was just sort of on physical copies that were sort of
Mm.
distributed locally, but then that CM Ralph and had sort of shared the game at a local event where it got more attention, and then they gave permission for it to be uploaded to these early internet boards, and that started in the U.S., but then quickly sort of, as CM Ralph said, took a life of its own and made its way to Europe, and then globally. And yeah, it happens through just uploading the file. And I think that they mentioned the archive, the LGBTQ video game archive talks about this, that they don't have like exact great numbers for exactly, how many copies of it got out there, because they were just sort of going off of like the download stats that they had on the board, which weren't
Mm.
necessarily very accurate. Um, and in that way, like, I think it's like an important sort of bit of like AIDS media again, that like uh, so much of AIDS activism at the time was using those early internet message boards to share resources that
Yeah.
communities weren't finding elsewhere, right? Certainly their governments weren't giving to
Mm.
them. The pharmaceutical industry wasn't giving to them initially, but they could find each other and support each other through these internet message boards.
I love. We'll move on from that in just a second, but I do love the fundraising, b the whole narrative about how that was uh queer female presenting people that were really kind of looking after being the mamas of the age generation. um but I love, in the most 80s possible way, the original way of getting hold of the game was having to go into, and I'm gonna get this wrong because I don't know San Francisco that well, but you used to be able to have to tear a coupon off the sort of the local gay rag that was available, write in,
That's awesome.
yes, please send me one copy of your finest game, and send it off, and they would post it to you. That's just delightful.
Yeah, it is, right? Like, just like there's just by necessity then like that focus on both physical media and local community, right?
Yeah,
Where it just makes it feel so, I guess the word that's coming to mind is homebrew, right? It's
yeah,
so
literally,
homebrew, it's so
literally.
like garage band kind of thing, but that lets it be a lot more sort of punk and effective, I think, in what it,
Yeah,
wants
it
to
is.
do.
And I think you made a very fair point also about the fact that day one was an indie game, and we're still now 35 years later seeing indie games made by queer people
Being the
for queer
leaders, yeah.
people and leading the way in queer representation. That is kind of that thread that goes all the way through that 35 years. I find that absolutely fascinating as well. We mentioned that Cape and the Castro is probably the first real kind of queer game, but there were
Mm.
references in kind of earlier games throughout the 80s. You mentioned Cody while we were chatting off air. You mentioned there was a Rocky Horror Picture Show game, which I find amazing. And then I believe the first proper one was actually a French game in 1985 called Le Crime du Parking, the crime of the parking lot. But it was a text adventure with a gay character. There was also Moon Mist in 1986, but I think 1988 probably with Birdo being that kind of debatable transgender character. I think there's been little instances of sort of queerness starting to pop in, but I think that we're sort of fairly set to establish, obviously, that Capering the Castro is the main kind of jumping off point going forward.
I mean,
Yeah.
when there are like instances of queer people being represented, but like as in the usual way, as like the other, and like in not the best representation before that.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I think a lot of the representation you see throughout the 80s, it's joke representation, right? It's like, look how funny these queer and trans people are, or it's even queer and trans people get used as sort of like a game over sort of thing. Like it's so like for example, the Leisure Suit Larry series. Like if
Yeah.
you get tricked into having a sort
Yeah.
of liaison with a queer or trans person, then it's like, oh, and it's that total trap narrative, right? Of like, oh, I got trapped in this, and then my game is over now because I just had sex with this trans person, and so game over, you failed. And so it's like it's that sort of like either joke representation or like, look how scary or manipulative these queer and trans people are. And so like, yeah, it's a lot of limitations like that. Then we get to some, Caper and the Castro is just something completely different. It's yeah, it's just by and for us in a way that a lot of the other things weren't beforehand.
And I should just really quickly say as well that Capering the Castro is available to play.
I was going to say it was like lost media for a while, wasn't it?
It's not. It's actually on the Internet Archive. I'm just going to drop a link into chat.
Was it back? I think it
And
was in 2017. CM found a copy of it or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So when Adrian Shaw, the founder of the LGBTQ Video Game Archive, originally reached out to CM Ralph about the game and like had just basically like heard about it and seen some of these sort of print media mentions of it, CM Ralph was like, I don't think I have it anymore. Right, I think it's been lost, but then they found a copy of it, and with that, and then the I think it was the Internet Archive and then the Strong Museum of Play, they were able to get like a working sort of emulation version of it going that then people can play it now.
Yeah, so the link I just put in chat is to archive.org, and there's the top of the screen. If you just click to begin, it starts an emulator, so you can play the first ever LGBTQ video game.
Yeah.
Not now. Listen to the podcast now, then play it afterwards.
Yeah,
I think it is bundled as well with a guide, because I will sort of flag, it's that generation of sort of like point and click games where the answers might not immediately be obvious, like to the things you're looking for. And so if you ever get stuck, there is a guide for it too that can sort of help you through those points.
And it's also probably worth just a content warning on some of the language and the phraseology being used is more of an 80s phraseology than something we would kind of necessarily use in some ways today as well. But that's history, that's time. Moving forward then.
I was just going to say, to circle back to the initial question, like what are some moments that stick out to you, Cody, as like some key moments in like LGBTQI plus video game history?
Yeah. I'm going to try and limit myself to just a couple of things. I remember like when I was first working in the archive, one of the things that like really surprised me was actually which games have a decent amount of queer representation in them. And like one of the series that actually has the most queer representation is Grand Theft Auto.
Really?
And it is, yeah. And that like shocked me the first time I heard it, but then like you think about it a little bit more and it kind of makes sense. Again, there it's often not great representation, it's often still either joke representation or like look at these seedy sex workers. They add such, character to our city or something like that. But like that like throughout I would say the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, that there's this steady growth in queer representation, which again, it's not always good representation. And by good there, I mean like it's not always like affirming of queer
Hmm.
people. Sometimes it's we're the butt of jokes, whatever. But there's this steady growth, even within a mainstream industry that often didn't consider us or, didn't want to include us, but that yet we're still there. And alongside that, this thing, the second thing that really stands out to me is that sort of through line that Robin you mentioned, right? Of like all through that 35 years, queer people have been making games for
Mm,
ourselves the entire time. A lot of that content I don't think had a public face to it until we get to like the last 10 to 15 years and we have things like itch.io and
Hmm.
Steam where people can sort of self-publish a game that they made. And I think that's part of why we see now this explosion
yeah.
of queer games content, which is just really great. Um, but I think that was happening sort of all along. It's just the tools are more accessible to make games now, and it's easier
Yeah.
to get them out there and share them with each other now.
Would you say there was like a moment, like a moment of queer representation in video games that just stuck out to you and spoke to you and said, "Okay, this is it. This is a game changer now." Whether that be,
For me personally, I think the moment like that for me was the game Gone Home in
oh,
2013. Although, like, I will say that like that was sort of like getting more toward like my own personal sort of gaming history than I would say like the
hmm,
history of queer games writ large. But I feel like Gone Home was such a sort of like watershed moment because it was the first time I think we saw an indie game go mainstream in a way,
Mm,
right? Like where it
hmm,
got a lot of attention, it was incredibly successful, and that it had as its main sort of story a queer romance, and so like I think that for me, both personally and then I guess maybe I would say more broadly for queer games too, like that was a big moment, that was transformative. In the same way that like some years later, seeing that kiss that Ellie had in The Last of
mm,
Us, and we saw that on like the main stage. I can't, if it was E3 or something.
hmm
Like that was something that 15, 20 years prior, I would have never thought we'd see. I'd be like that. Maybe my kids will get to see that or something, but I won't. And then so like
yeah.
but then we have those moments. It's like, oh, but wait, that can happen with a lot of work, a lot of people pushing for it, but it can happen.
There's been some
Hmm.
really interesting examples, and I think the one that sort of actually stands out to me is back in 1998 with Fallout 2, um, because it was the first example of forgive me, first example of same-sex marriage in a video game. And I think what was most interesting about it was it was 6 years before same-sex marriage became legal in the US, and 18 years before the first legal same-sex marriage in the UK. So actually, where games have had a nasty habit of sort of following society change, this one sort of leapt ahead and kind of put a marker down. And I just found that absolutely fascinating in terms of sort of how it plays off against societal, where society is. That one seemed quite far ahead of it.
I mean, like as you said, like this is kind of like more of a personal history thing. So let's move into
Mm,
personal histories then. Cody, yourself, is there any other thing else that like stands out? You mentioned Gone Home, and obviously like a pivotal moment for the industry being like Ellie and their kiss. Is there any other like moments for you that are just personal to you?
Yeah, a couple come to mind, and I think this actually builds on sort of what Robin was just saying too. Like in the
Mm,
2000s, the Fable series
mhm.
allowing you to have same-sex relationships. I remember that being incredibly important to my younger self. Like that was like I heard that about the game. And I was like, oh my god, you can do that in that game. I need to go try that. But like I was also very closeted at the time, so it was like, oh, I don't let my parents know about this. But like it was like that sort of like queer clandestine sort of thing that happened well before marriage equality was passed in the states. So like there were these moments like that where even a mainstream game like the Fable games, that they had those options. Though like even there, if you have like a same-sex relationship in that game, it kind of treats the queer sex as like being joke sex, like if you like in the first game you like go to bed with your partner and like the lights go down and it just starts making sex noises, and if you have a same-sex partner, at least if it were two men, like the noises you heard were like oh ooh, and it was like really clearly meant to be a joke.
Is that not the sound that every gay man makes in
Yeah.
bed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Standard in my house.
They just had a freak on the development team. That's it. It's
Yeah.
like, yo, Greg, you're gay. What kind of sounds do gay people make in bed? And he's just like, ooh. We'll use that, thank you. In fact, could you get in the booth? That would be great.
We've got it right there. And I think for me personally, I was also really drawn to early MMOs as well. Like as in their like, it's not like the games themselves were particularly queer. They didn't have like queer characters or quests most of the time, but they were these sort of big online spaces where you could meet other people and find other people like you, and also make characters like you could make yourself look like in the game what you wanted to look like, in a way that like allowed this sort of self-fashioning and experimentation that I couldn't do where I was, at the time in the actual world. It just wouldn't have been safe for me to do that, but I could do it in, Guild Wars or World of Warcraft or something.
Yeah. Final Fantasy 14 is so queer. So queer.
The gayest.
Such a big queer contingent of that game, and just the designs themselves. But yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I have a very similar experience with like BioWare games. Like BioWare games were the first instance for me of like truly, as a trans person, being very closeted at the time, being able to see like just project myself onto a character, and just be like, yeah, this is the kind of person that I would be in this fictional world where this kind of thing were possible. And those were always very meaningful to me. Not the best track record with queer representation, but better than most. So yeah, pretty good on that end.
We'll take it. I think for me, in terms of personal stuff, The Sims. I think it's kind of as a small town gal, sort of living in a place that I couldn't really sort of be necessarily.
Small town girl living in a lonely world. Got it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much that as an only child, yeah. But it was a way of kind of like, oh, I can experiment and I can kind of get my kicks. I mean, the problem was I had both my parents were teachers and they taught at the school that I went to.
Oh no.
So that kind of erased any kind of like childhood experimentation you wanted to try. So I made The Sims do it. No, yeah, but I think it kind of like, and I know that anecdotally there's a lot of people that have used The Sims to kind of explore their backgrounds and explore their kind of identities and how they want to project themselves into the world as well. But I think just actually another one, going back onto what I think Cody said, was Grand Theft Auto. I'm actually quite a big fan of Grand Theft Auto. And I remember it was GTA 4 that had the DLC, The Ballad of Gay Tony, where actually it had some slightly heavy, clunky moments, but actually the character wasn't as camp and effeminate as you thought it was going to be, and it actually was a sort of like relatively heteronormative-ish kind of guy that was sort of more just being himself. And okay, he was a gangster that killed people, but hey, who isn't? And I think that's kind of, for me, it was more just like, oh, there's actually real people in the world. And then, yeah, moving forward, yeah, I think GTA's got a terrible reputation in some ways for all of that. But looking forward to GTA 6, because we were part of the open letter. Little sidebar for a second of an achievement, but we were part of an open letter that we sent to Rockstar about could they take out some of the transphobic elements from their GTA 5 remake, which they did. And they promised, fantastic. And they promised in GTA 6 not to punch down on minorities. So I take that as a slight win that we're gaming affecting change in the world. But yeah, no, so GTA literally forming queer history right there.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And like, like I said a moment ago, right? Like you gotta fight for it, but like change does happen, right? Like you can make it happen. And that's a great example of
Yeah.
it. I love that you mentioned BioWare too, because it actually spawned one of my favorite little queer indie games too, that Anthropy made. It was back when the Knights of the Old Republic MMO came out, the Old Republic, and initially they did not have same-sex relationships in it, but then they were releasing one of their expansions that then would allow you to have same-sex relationships just on the new planet they were adding. So it
Oh
was
my
like
god, awesome.
It's the
not
gay
in the
sex
broader
planet.
galaxy, but you can have it on the gay planet that
Here
we're
it's
adding.
legal, yeah.
And so Anthropy sort of released this parody game that was called The Hunt for the Gay Planet. and it
Hunt for
was
Uranus.
yeah, it was this great Twine game that was just all about like going on this adventure, trying to find what's the planet that the gays can be on.
I'm trying to find imagery of that. Oh, damn, I can't see
There
any
was
imagery.
the first Juhani in that game was the first openly queer character in the Star Wars universe. Obviously she lived on the queer planet, obviously, because that's all she could do.
Exactly. Everyone's
there you
just
go.
on that planet.
What an amazing planet.
Damn.
Cody, your work has seen you be part of, and we've mentioned it a few times already, the LGBTQ video game archive with the wonderful Adrian Shaw and her team. For the people that don't know, and shame on you, about the LGBTQ video game archive, could you just give us maybe a little overview, where it came from, what it does, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. The LGBTQ Video Game Archive was founded by Adrian Shaw at Temple University, and it really sort of grew out of a need to know what queer content was out there in games, right? I think that Adrian, while she was doing her research, which focused on sort of queer players, queer player communities, was really quickly encountering like, well, there is queer content out there. There have been queer games for decades, but like that's not all sort of collected anywhere. And so the archive sort of was established to address that need, right? To try and sort of make a repository where all examples of queer games, queer game content, mentions, characters, all of that could be gathered in one place. So researchers, the general public, just gamers wanting to find new games to play, that they could find that all in one place. And so it would be more accessible, right? More centrally located for people to be able to find that information. And so that's how it got started, and it really just it grew with Adrian established it. I and other people came along to sort of help work on it in different ways. My own work was, I think I wrote the Bioshock entries for it and a couple of others, and then I helped with collecting. So like anytime there's a game in the archive, we also try to include links or documents or files that sort of show what the content was. And my work also included like collecting backups of all of those links and files, because it's the internet, and it
Yep.
proves to be a
Yeah.
shockingly ephemeral place where things go
Yep.
dark and disappear all the time. So that was a lot of my work.
Funnily enough, I just tried to click on a link for like either an article or some page on the hunt for the gay planet, and it just sent me into like a loading loop, and nothing loaded. And I was like, oh, well, never mind. I guess
that's
maybe
lost to
there's something
history.
there. Maybe there's something there on the LGBTQ video game archive.
We might have a
Funnily
file
enough-
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Hopefully.
Just a map to find the queer planet. That's all we need.
Yes, please, just give me that. Not that I can get off this rock anytime soon.
Yeah.
But there are going to be some people out there who are like, ugh, queer. Ugh, why do we need these things? The dummies, the people that are not that smart. And I doubt they'd be tuning into this show. But for those people out there that might not understand the importance, why do we think it's what do you think it's important to record and memorialize the history of LGBTQIA plus video games?
Yeah, for me, I always go, and this is something that Adrian has said in her work before, and it's something that I just know from personal experience as well, in a way that I think probably a lot of us do. But like, queer games and finding queer characters and narratives
Mm.
like allows you to sort of see what life can be like even before you ever get to live it or
Mm.
experience it yourself. And in that way, it sort of makes something more possible for you, right? Like being able to see other people like you can then, make it more possible for you to live, right? For you
Mhm.
to imagine what your future might look like or not look like sometimes too. Um, and I would maybe like add to that, and this is coming from Audre Lorde's work, which I often teach with. Like Audre Lorde talks about like how if you don't look to history or if you don't look to your elders, then you're sort of doomed to constantly try to reinvent the wheel because you think
Yeah.
like, oh, well, no one's ever had this before, so I'm going to invent some new solution to it. But like if you have it recorded somewhere or if you go talk to your elders, there's a lot of wisdom to be had there, right? Of like, I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I can, learn and adapt and evolve based on what people did before.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean,
Have
it's sorry, Mia.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just really picking up on that first point you made, like it's something that I've used a few times when I've been sort of talking about the power of queer games and the power to influence, the power to help people discover themselves, but also the power to help other people, straight people, discover and at least be sympathetic towards our community. Because typically the old-fashioned phrase is like, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in someone else's shoes. Well, in video games, you literally can. You literally can
Mm.
walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And I think that's why it's so important to have these moments of history kind of recorded and savored.
I feel like a lot of allies are like very ignorant to queer history as well. I mean, there's probably a lot of queer people that are ignorant to
Mm.
queer history too. And having that as a resource there is just such a great thing just to say, listen, this is what people had to go through even to get something produced back in the day. And they had to share it on message boards in some instances to even get it out there because of like the ongoing crises at the time. To follow that up, do you think there's any worry like that? This is another part of the importance there, that there's so much like rewriting attempts to rewrite history these days when it comes to like queer representation. Would you say that's like something that these resources would help to prevent, or would you say that's of great importance?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I guess I'm aware of a couple things, in thinking about that question. Like the first being that so much of queer history is also just sort of it's unearthing something or sort of
Mm.
bringing something out from the shadows that had to be in the shadows, right? Because for safety reasons or because of laws and regulations that moved it to the shadows or whatever. And so, like, the queer history is super important, I think, in that, like, it helps us see queer lives that have always been there, despite the fact that a lot of people try to frame this like, we've got so many queers and trans people today. It's like, oh, where did they all come from? It's like, we've always been here. It's just, we
Mm.
weren't able to be as visible, I think, as we are hopefully, are now
Mm.
and will be more in the future. And so, like, I think it's almost like we're not even too rewriting it yet. We're just still writing the history, and then we'll keep rewriting it as we find more things too, right? Like, and talk to more
Mhm.
people, collect more people's experiences and stories. Um, but I'm also aware of like the current attempts in the US right now, and I think elsewhere too, to rewrite history to shove queers out of it again too, to be
Mm.
like,
Mhm.
like, the woke mob is coming to make our kids gay, so, don't let them learn their history.
Yeah,
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. That's
exactly. But I mean, so how do we
It's a
then?
threat, essentially, isn't it? It's a
It's a
threat
huge
to like
threat.
to them. It's because it's the truth, and like
That's
they
it.
just
mhm,
they can't handle
It's
it.
it
So.
it goes the same way as kind of Black history and Asian American history. Like there's
mhm.
so many different histories that is not white and straight that people are, particularly in Florida, are just trying to sort of shove off into the sea. And it's just like we have to stand our ground. Um,
Don't worry, Florida will one day be in the sea, so I
It'll
think
be in the
it's a
sea
tit
as
for
well.
tat.
I mean, so long as they can keep Key West, I love Key West. Keep Key West, shove everything else into the sea. Sorry, Florida.
Unfortunately, I
How?
think Key West would be one of those places in
Yeah, I
the
know.
sea.
First
But
under. It's almost under. It's almost under anyway.
Queer people
but
and
there you
allies
go.
in Florida buy life jackets. Buy life
Yes,
jackets.
exactly. Yeah, just
Yeah.
learn to float.
We like you.
Um,
Sorry, Robin. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I will get through this question. In terms of the past, then, to influence the future, what are we looking at in terms of where do we think representation is going next? Like recently, we've ticked off, even in the last few years, we've ticked off asexual representation in the Outer Worlds. We've ticked off playable trans representation in Tell Me Why. We've ticked off quite a lot. Where are we going to go next, using what we've learned before and using that history and going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking to games like Caper and the Castro, like, and this goes back to again that through line of, queer indie games that's always been there. But like, I think that we're going to continue to see more and varied queer indie games. And I'm absolutely, I don't think we can have enough of that because even with all of that, a colleague and I published a paper a couple years ago that was even with, yes, we have more asexual representation, we have more of these other things, but like there are particular like intersections of identity that people obviously are living in, but that aren't represented at all still. So, for example, I think that we found that we couldn't find examples of black trans men at all in games. So we couldn't find a single instance of a black trans man in a game, and maybe that that's since changed, hopefully so. But like, so even as the representation is improving, there are still sort of people and intersections of identity that are left out there. So I think that we still need more stories and more people telling their stories through games.
I like I envision maybe one day my perfect key moment will be like a new major AAA title comes out that like everybody loves. It's like a continuation of a series. Next Call of Duty, all the characters are queer. Just all the characters are queer. The people who play it every year don't have a choice. They've got to deal with it. Walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Yeah. Yeah. Like that
Actually,
doesn't happen. That's what they say happens, but it doesn't happen. Sorry, go on.
Good point. No. Good point. In terms of representation, we're going to be really quick because I know we're getting slightly tight on time. But in terms of representation and things to go forward, we've seen an awful lot recently about being able to play LGBTQ, being what we call player sexual or pansexual or whatever, where you can choose to be gay or you can choose to have a queer storyline, but you might not. You might choose not to, and that's totally fine. But I think that
we did a whole podcast about it. Funnily enough,
we did do a whole podcast about. Well, you did. I wasn't there. But what I think is actually really important is like Tell Me Why. More games that just normalize having a queer character, and there ain't no getting around it. You have to play as a queer character because we've had 50 years, 40 years of playing straight characters. Like it's about time that people started to kind of just embrace this is a person, this is the playable character. By the way, they're gay, deal with it. I think more of that because that will continue to normalize, continue to press people into walking a mile in someone else's shoes. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And like there are so many queer indie games that like are I would say like the AAA approach is often to sort of give you that sexual gender buffet of like, look at all of these options you can have, and all of them want to fuck you. How wonderful.
I love
But
Baldur's
like
Gate 3 as much as we love Baldur's Gate 3.
I love Baldur's Gate 3.
And if they don't, you can mod it and then you can.
Exactly. But then like so many queer indie games are actually about like limitations, right? They're about like you don't actually get to sort of self-select out of this, or you don't get to decide exactly who the character is or who they fall in love with. Like this is a set story and you're going to experience that story. And I think that there's actually something really wonderful about that too, right? Like that not everything has to be for everyone, but like there can be really wonderful queer and trans things that are specific and limited, but also very meaningful in those limitations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So, lastly, before we wrap up here, what are you currently working on, Cody? What are we? Where are we at with LGBTQI plus games research?
Yeah, I think we're in like a really fantastic and also challenging moment. We were just talking about this a little bit before the stream started, but the archive is kind of in an interesting moment too, where now there's just so much content out there that
Mhm.
we kind of have to figure out a new way to still do that work and keep it sustainable, because it's not really doable now for, a team of, 3 or 5 or 7 people to collect all of these things and still be able to do that and do our day jobs at the same time. So like I think we're at this like wonderful explosion of queer and trans content, but we also kind of need more people involved and also need to
Mhm.
figure out sort of how we continue to bring all of that together to continue making it available to people. Um, but yeah, so continue doing that, but doing it in a sustainable way, given the exponential growth. In my own work, I would say that I'm really interested in telling sort of more local and regional queer stories. So, like my lab at UB is called the Omnitrix Gaming Lab and Studio. We focus on this thing called community storytelling, which it's just a term that we use for like we like to work with communities to tell the stories they want to tell. And one of the things that we're starting now is a project that we're calling Gaming in the Rust Belt. And it's looking at Rust Belt sort of communities and cultures in the US that often don't have a lot of stories told about them, and
Mhm.
certainly not
Mm.
queer or trans
Mm.
stories told about them. But other than, I always get the title wrong because my brain just matches it up, but, like, Stone Butch Blues, is a story that was, it's a very Rust Belt sort of queer story, right, novel. But so we're looking to do that with games, right? We're looking to, like, make games that tell, like, local and regional history, and look for stories that just haven't really been told before. And I hope that we see a lot more of that in other places too going forward.
Oh, that's really cool. I love that. And you mentioned volunteers. Is there a place that people can potentially like get in contact or step forward if they wanted to be a volunteer?
Yeah, I mean, with both things I mentioned, with the archive, there is a contact form. You can also reach out to either Adrian or anyone working with the archive, and we can help make sure that you're connected, to the conversation and what that ends up looking like.
Mhm.
And then with the Omnitrix lab, that's also open to people outside my university too. If you want to collaborate with us or get involved, just reach out to the email contacts on our website too. And should I write that in the chat maybe somewhere? Or
Yeah. If you want to pop that down, we'll make sure that that gets
Yeah, you drop that in
brought
the
up.
chat. I mean, for the audio listeners, I just shared a link on screen, which is no use to you at all. So the
That was
video game
yeah. Go
the,
ahead.
the video game archive is available at lgbtqgamearchive.com.
Yes, absolutely. And again, if you're looking to support Cody's uh, other wonderful work, you can head on over to the Amatrix Gaming Lab and Studio, which I'm not sure if is there a specific website for that? I guess if you just Google that, it'll
yeah,
just
I
come up.
think the easiest way will probably to be to
Yeah,
Google
Yeah.
it. And
it's
so
Okay.
Amatrix is spelled Amatryx, and then Gaming Lab. If you Google just Amatrix Gaming Lab, it will pop up probably as the first or second result. So
Wonderful. Right, we have a little bit of time left, so we're going to move on to our last section that we like to call Show Me What You Got, which is our little show and tell section. Our guest has brought in one item that holds some significance to them. It could be something special. A game that they're looking forward to, a movie that they love. Who knows? But we're going to find out. Do we want Cody to go first today?
yes.
Yeah, let's let you go. Cody,
Special guest first.
yeah, you
awesome.
go first. Tell us, you've got a screenshot for us. You tell us what this
I
is about.
do. Oh, and thank you for pulling it up for me. So this is a screenshot from my World of Warcraft guild. I've been a longtime World of Warcraft player. I think I started playing in 2007, 2008. Not with the same group the whole time, but this was my guild that killed Killed. That was so violent, out of context. But we finally killed the boss Sylvanas in World of Warcraft. This was in the Shadowlands expansion a few years ago, and so after we beat this final boss, then we all gathered around for a screenshot, and someone had their rainbow generator item there. So very,
That's
we
so
planned it
awesome.
for this Pride share. We just knew this was coming. But I've always really enjoyed the communal aspect of raiding, getting people together, and trying to do something difficult with each other, and supporting each other through it. And so that's this.
That's so cool. I want to apologize. That was the goofiest laugh that I just burst out with as well in the middle of that.
I love it.
Yes, it's always wonderful to see. Again, just like any kind of queer representation in games where you don't normally get it either, especially like in MMOs. Just give us all the rainbows, all of them. Robin, you've not done this yet, have you?
I
Would you
haven't.
like to?
This is my first time showing something on the internet.
Oh, okay, all right. Would you?
Excuse me while
we
I
might
whip
get
this
banned
out.
depending. Twitch TOS, but okay, we'll see. Show me what you got. Fingers crossed.
You can see behind me an awful lot of Lego collections. Now, I was bought this by my loving partner at Christmas, and I haven't been able to show it to many people, but it's my Lego. It's my Lego Infinity Gauntlet. That's what I was after.
Infinity Gauntlet.
That's fantastic.
Which is actually quite delicate because it's all literally thousands and thousands of pieces of.
Don't drop
Lego.
it.
No, I know.
Don't drop it.
But it's even the sort of like the fingers are opposable as well, so you can literally sort of like you can just if you're really fed up with someone in a meeting, you can just sit there and just flip them off in the background.
Well, this was going to be my question, but you said it's delicate. Can you snap the fingers? Can you do the snap?
No. It's literally
God.
You can only go up and down, and the thumbs.
You can snap off the fingers.
Yeah, I mean you can snap them off, but we're not going to do that, are we? But yeah, that's my.
It's very nice. And it's got multicolored gems on there, so it's technically like queer themed. It's a rainbow as well.
Rainbows.
Mia, what's yours?
I will show you what I've got. Nintendo sent me this. They just released the remake of Paper Mario: The 1,000-Year Door. So they sent me like a papercraft battle stage, which is very, very awesome. A post that I made about this just went like semi-viral on Twitter as well. It's got like 3,500 likes so far, and I think the Paper Mario fans found it. But yeah, I wanted to bring that up because I wanted to mention, not just because it's incredibly cool and took me over 2 hours to put together, but Vivian, the character Vivian that they reconfirmed is actually a trans character. They were a trans character in the initial Japanese release, and then in the UK version back in the day, I think it was around 2002, 2003, Nintendo of America and the translation team, like, they completely censored that out of like the US release. But now that the new game is out, they've restored that Vivian is a trans character who's one of your like allies that you travel with and battle with. And I don't know, I'm very happy about that. That was going to be one of the moments that I mentioned earlier as well, like the key moments for me. That and Bridget from Guilty Gear being confirmed.
I was going to mention this actually back in the conversation, just to jump back into it for 2 seconds. But there's been, particularly through the 90s and early 2000s, that when there wasn't necessarily a kind of bold amount of LGBTQ representation, there was an awful lot of potentially things that were lost in translation, where there were kind of examples, particularly in kind of trans characters, that were kind of either zeroed out in translation, or there were instances where the character was either mistranslated and what should have just been a girl turned into a boy who was a girl. And then there's kind of like language barrier issues and stuff that kind of started to raise various shades of the trans flag and stuff. And I think it's fantastic that either they've been put back in, or they've been confirmed, or what was maybe a kind of, as I say, a bit of lost in translation was kind of someone, they fell on the right side of the coin and said, yes, this is definitely a trans character. And I think that's fantastic.
It's great to see it. There's so many naysayers on Twitter now trying to argue that the character was originally a cross-dresser in Japanese, but like you go into like Japan, and again there's that lost in translation element because they have words like, again, this is considered like not a great word in Japan to describe trans people, but like new half and things like that they use instead of actually using the word trans, because they don't really have a word for trans, so they couldn't directly overtly say it. But yeah, the character is trans, I mean, it's straight from the author's mouth at this point. Accept it. Accept
Mm.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always going to be pushback too. But like this is reminding me too of like one of the things the archive does try to capture, and it's really a hard thing to sort of capture all of it. But like the importance of people interpreting a character as queer or trans too, right? Like where there are hints that the character might be, and like some of it can be like that lost in translation stuff, but it could also just be like something about this character and the way that they speak or talk or do things, feels queer to me.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so we also try to include those things in the archive wherever we can as well. Whenever there's, a bunch of players who have said like, oh yeah, like we thought that this felt really, really queer. And there's always going to be people, oh, that's not queer. But I'm thinking of like one of my gaming friends and I like recently were like, we discovered that we were both really into like playing healers that are about shielding people, and we're like, there's something really sort of queer about that desire to sort of shield yourself and others.
I love
So
that.
like now every example of like magic that shields people, it's all gay. It's all gay
Yeah.
now. We've declared it.
Hell yes, that is a wonderful sentiment
It's a
to lead the
fantastic place to
podcast
end
on. So yeah, fantastic. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I hope you had a good time, Cody.
Oh, this is fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, and and Robin, back again. Thank you so much for showing your face. We'll be seeing more of you this
Yes,
limited DigiPride
yes,
season.
I will be back very
Oh.
soon, I think.
Wonderful.
And thank you, Mia, for joining us again and helming the return of the show.
I love it.
So
Yeah, you can't
enough
really
of
do
that.
it without me. I mean, look at me.
Well,
I'm
exactly. That's
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I do want to say a massive thank you to everyone else for joining us on this episode of the Gaming Podcast.
Yes, and as Mia said earlier, we have so much live streaming content coming up for DigiPride, so make sure that you're following Gaming Mag channel here on Twitch and on TikTok and YouTube. So wherever you go, you don't miss any of these amazing shows. Check out gaminmag.com/DigiPride for the full schedule of everything we've got coming up over the next 6 weeks. And of course, podcasts can be listened back, and I promise I will start doing this again on all major podcast platforms. So if you're listening there, come on over to Twitch to watch us live and join in the fun and see all the things on screen that we're showing that you can't see in the show and tell section.
Yeah, just head on over to Gaming Mag on Twitch or YouTube. And again, thanks to our presenting partner, Jamma Games, our sponsor, Devolver Digital and Wizards of the Coast. We will see you next week for another podcast episode, and I am back this Tuesday with a first look at Enotria. Enotria. Like every time I read it, I get it wrong. Enotria, the last song that's going to be on Let's Go Gaming with special guest Dandy Floss. They're a Souls-like expert. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be great. Until then, don't forget to keep reading and watching Gaming Magazine, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thanks. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.